My father-in-law's hands trembled as he placed his coffee mug on the conference room table. The same hands that had built this store from nothing 40 years ago. Now betraying his distress as my husband Brian dismissed decades of wisdom with a single, cruel laugh. I'm Daniela, and I used to believe family meant something sacred in this business. But that laugh, that dismissive, arrogant sound, shattered more than just the morning quiet of our weekly management meeting. Dad, nobody cares about personal relationships with suppliers anymore, Brian said, his voice dripping with condescension. It's about maximizing profits, streamlining operations. Your handshake deals and coffee chats are relics. Frank's shoulders hunched forward slightly, but his voice remained steady. Those relationships saved us during the recession of '08 when bigger stores went under. Our suppliers gave us better terms because you waste time playing golf with them and remembering their kids' names? Brian interrupted, rolling his eyes at me as if expecting me to join in his mockery. We're leaving money on the table with your outdated methods. I gripped my pen tighter, watching Frank's face fall. The fluorescent lights seemed harsh suddenly, highlighting every line of disappointment etched across his features. This wasn't the first time Brian had dismissed his father's experience, but something about today felt different. More final. The store has been profitable for 40 years, Frank said quietly. We've put 3 kids through college, supported 15 families through steady employment, and never missed a vendor payment. Brian stood up, straightening his designer tie. And we could be doing 10 times better if you just step back and let me modernize things. The world's changed, Dad. Either we change with it, or we die. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight. I watched Frank's coffee grow cold, untouched, while Brian tapped away at his phone, already moving on to his next meeting. The distance between father and son stretched wider than the mahogany table between them. Daniela understands what I'm talking about, don't you, honey? Brian's question caught me off guard. Tell Dad how outdated his methods are. I met Frank's eyes across the table, eyes that had always shown kindness, wisdom, and now, a deep hurt that made my stomach twist. In that moment, I saw something else in my husband's face too, something cold and calculating that I'd been trying to ignore for months. I think, I said carefully, that there's value in both approaches. Brian's jaw tightened. He stood up abruptly, gathering his papers. Well, when you're both done living in the past, I'll be in my office making actual progress. As he strode out, leaving the door open behind him, I watched Frank trace the rim of his coffee mug with one weathered finger. The gesture reminded me of how he used to draw circles on the counter while teaching me the business years ago. Patient and thorough in his explanations. Something had to give. And soon. The store's inventory system crashed 3 days after Brian fired our longtime IT manager, Martin. 15 years of customer data and supplier records, gone in an instant. I stood in the server room, watching our new tech consultant shake his head at screens full of error messages. This wouldn't have happened if Martin was still here, Frank said quietly beside me. His face had grown gaunt in recent weeks, the stress etching deeper lines around his eyes. He knew this system inside out. Martin was making 6 figures to maintain outdated equipment. Brian's voice cut through the room as he strode in, phone in hand. Our new cloud-based solution will save us. Save us what? I interrupted, surprising myself with the edge in my voice. The loyalty program data is gone. Every customer preference, every special order, every numbers in a database. Brian waved his hand dismissively. We'll rebuild it. Better. More efficient. Frank pressed his hand against the wall, steadying himself. Those numbers represented relationships, son. Mrs. Peterson's granddaughter's allergies. The Anderson family's holiday traditions. 20 years of trust. I watched Brian's jaw clench, that familiar look of contempt flickering across his face. Trust doesn't pay the bills, Dad. Speaking of which, I've scheduled dinner tonight to discuss the new direction for the store. 7 sharp, at LeBlanc. The French place? Frank frowned. That's a bit Appropriate for what I have to announce, Brian cut in, already turning to leave. Daniela, wear something nice. This is important. After he left, I helped Frank into his office chair, noting how his hands trembled as he reached for his blood pressure medication. Maybe we should skip dinner, I suggested. Your health. No, Frank's voice was firm. Whatever he's planning, I need to be there. The store. It's not just a business, Daniela. It's family, I finished, squeezing his shoulder. That evening at Le Blanc, surrounded by crystal glasses and white tablecloths, I watched Brian order expensive wine while Frank picked at his salad. The tension was thick enough to cut with the sterling silver knives. I've secured funding to modernize the store, Brian announced between sips of Bordeaux. We're going digital first, minimizing inventory, maximizing turnover. The old building will be renovated into a modern retail space. Frank's fork clattered against his plate. The building your grandfather built? Which is hemorrhaging money through energy inefficiency, Brian countered. The board agrees. The board? Frank's voice cracked. What board? Brian smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I brought in investors. The paperwork goes through next week. It's time to join the 21st century, Dad. You should be thanking me. I watched Frank's face drain of color, and something inside me snapped. The wine glass in my hand suddenly felt like a weapon. The receipt fell from Brian's expense report like a poison leaf, dinner for two at the Skyline Hotel. Dated last Tuesday, when he was supposedly at a supplier meeting in Detroit. My fingers trembled as I pulled up his credit card statements on the computer, each new transaction cutting deeper than the last. Champagne charges. Jewelry store receipts. A weekend booking at a boutique hotel downtown, paid in cash, but logged in the company expenses as a business conference. The office felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in as I scrolled through months of similar patterns. A knock at my door made me jump. Everything okay? Frank asked, leaning heavily on his cane. You look like you've seen a ghost. I minimized the screen quickly. Just reviewing some accounts. The lie tasted bitter. Did you need something? He shuffled in, closing the door behind him. Actually, there's something I've been meaning to discuss. His eyes darted to the photo on my desk, Brian and me at last year's Christmas party. Both smiling. Both lying. Have you met the new marketing consultant? Jasmine? The name felt wrong in my mouth. Brian hired her last month. 24 years old, fresh out of college, Frank said quietly. Quite pretty. Stays late most nights, I'm told. Always when Brian does. The implications hung in the air like smoke. I thought of the hotel receipts, the late meetings, the weekend conferences. Why are you telling me this? My voice sounded distant, even to myself. Frank placed a hand on my shoulder, gentle, but firm. Because you're family, Daniela. Real family. And because I've watched my son destroy enough things I love. The printer whirred to life as another expense report emerged. A restaurant bill with two distinct signatures, Brian's scrawl, and below it, a looping J. I should have said something sooner, Frank continued, his voice heavy with regret. But I thought. I hoped he'd remember who he was. Who we raised him to be. My phone buzzed, a text from Brian, working late tonight. Don't wait up. I opened my drawer, pulled out the stack of suspicious receipts I'd been collecting. How long have you known? About the affair? 3 weeks. About the investors? Frank's face darkened. That's worse. He's not just renovating the store, Daniela. He's selling it. Piece by piece. The land alone is worth millions to developers. The truth crashed over me like a wave, washing away the last traces of denial. I thought of the wine glass at dinner, how I'd wanted to throw it. Now I understood why. What are you going to do? Frank asked softly. I reached for my phone, scrolling through contacts until I found the number of Tom, Frank's old friend from the police force. Now a private investigator. Everything, I replied. I'm going to do everything. Tom's manila envelope landed on my kitchen table with a dull thud. Inside, dozens of photographs spilled out like accusations, Brian and Jasmine entering hotels, sharing intimate dinners, walking hand in hand through the park. But it was the documents underneath that made my blood run cold. The store isn't just being renovated, Tom said, his weathered face grim. Brian's been moving assets into shell companies for months. The investors? They're not investing, they're buying pieces of the business at fire sale prices. My fingers traced over property deeds, bank statements, transfer documents. Each page revealed another betrayal, another calculated move to dismantle Frank's legacy, piece by piece. There's more, Tom hesitated, sliding another document forward. The medical bills. I scanned the paper, my vision blurring. Frank's heart condition, his medication, his treatments, all carefully hidden from the company's health insurance. Brian had been denying coverage, forcing his father to pay out of pocket. The doorbell rang, making me jump. Through the window, I saw Frank's car in the driveway. Hide these, I whispered to Tom, sweeping the evidence into the envelope. Please. Frank entered using his spare key, looking more tired than ever. Daniela? I need to talk to you about, he stopped short, seeing Tom. Oh. You already know. Frank, Tom stood, embracing his old friend. I'm sorry. Don't be, Frank's voice was stronger than I expected. I've made my peace with Brian's choices. But there's something else you both need to see. He pulled out a folded paper from his jacket, a draft of the final sale agreement for the store. My heart stopped when I saw the buyer's name. Jasmine Reynolds Development Corporation, I read aloud, the words bitter on my tongue. She's not just his mistress. She's the face of the development group that's been trying to buy the block for years, Frank finished. Brian didn't seduce her. She seduced him, knowing exactly who he was and what she could get from him. The irony of it struck me like a physical blow. Brian, so proud of his business acumen, had been played just as thoroughly as he'd played us. What do you want to do? Tom asked quietly. I looked at Frank, saw the mixture of heartbreak and resolve in his eyes. The same eyes that had welcomed me into this family 15 years ago, that had taught me everything about running the store, about loyalty, about love. We fight, I said, reaching for the envelope of evidence. But not for revenge. For justice. For family. Frank's hand covered mine, warm and steady. Together? Together, I agreed, already planning our next move. The game wasn't over, it was just beginning. I watched Brian and Jasmine through Tom's telephoto lens from across the street. They sat at their usual corner table in the upscale cafe, heads bent close together over documents. My camera clicked rapidly, capturing every intimate gesture, every shared smile, every betrayal. That's the third meeting this week, Tom murmured beside me. And look who just arrived. A man in an expensive suit approached their table, Marcus Chen, the city's most notorious real estate developer. The same developer who'd been trying to buy out the entire historic district for years. Send me everything you have on Chen, I said, lowering the camera. Every connection, every deal, every skeleton in his closet. Tom's hand touched my arm. Daniela, you're walking a dangerous line here. Chen isn't like Brian, he plays rough. So do I. The words came out harder than I intended. They're not just destroying the store. They're destroying Frank. Back at the office, I found Frank slumped over his desk, breathing heavily. His medication bottle lay empty beside him. I'm fine, he protested as I helped him up. Just forgot to refill the prescription. Because Brian canceled your insurance. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Frank's face fell. You know about that? I know everything. I pulled out my phone, showing him the photos from the cafe. Brian's not just selling the store. He's selling the whole block to Chen Development. Jasmine's company is just a front. My son wouldn't. Frank stopped, staring at the images. His hands trembled. All these years, I thought if I just loved him enough, taught him enough. A knock interrupted us. Jasmine stood in the doorway, her designer outfit incongruous against the store's worn wooden panels. Sorry to interrupt, she said, not sounding sorry at all. Brian wanted me to drop off these papers for your signature, Frank. Just some routine updates to the store's insurance policy. I snatched the documents before Frank could reach for them. You mean the policy that's being transferred to Chen Development? Jasmine's practiced smile flickered. I don't know what you're talking about. Get out, I said quietly. And tell Brian if these papers come anywhere near Frank again, I'm taking everything I have to the SEC. After she left, Frank gripped my hand. What are you going to do? I looked at the store around us, the weathered counters, the family photos, the lifetime of memories being sold off piece by piece. I'm going to burn it all down, I said. Not the store. Their whole scheme. And I'm going to make sure Brian feels every single flame. Frank's grip tightened. Whatever you're planning. Be careful. Don't let revenge consume you. But as I watched him struggle to stand, I wondered if revenge wasn't exactly what this situation needed. The boardroom felt like a tomb as I laid out the evidence one piece at a time. Photos of Brian and Jasmine. Bank statements. Property transfers. The shell company documents. Each item landed on the polished table with the weight of a funeral stone. Brian's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. Is this supposed to impress me? No, I said quietly. It's supposed to stop you. He laughed, the sound sharp and hollow. Stop me? From what, modernizing a failing business? Making actual profits instead of playing happy families? From destroying your father's legacy. His legacy? Brian stood, looming over the table. His legacy is a dying store in a dead neighborhood. But you wouldn't understand business, would you, Daniela? You're too busy playing devoted daughter to a man who isn't even your real father. The door opened. Frank stood there, pale but straight-backed, Tom beside him. Brian's smile faltered. Perfect timing, Brian recovered quickly. Dad, I was just about to call you. Your daughter-in-law here is trying to sabotage the store's future with these ridiculous accusations. I've seen the hospital bills, Frank cut him off. The ones you've been hiding from me. And the real estate contracts with Chen Development. Everything I did was legal, Brian's voice hardened. And necessary. This store would have died under your management. Legal? I pushed forward another document. Is that what Marcus Chen told you? Because the SEC might disagree about these particular property transfers. Brian's face drained of color. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Then mine. Then Frank's. Breaking news alerts. Marcus Chen arrested in federal fraud investigation, I read aloud. Development projects across city under scrutiny. Brian lunged for the documents, but Tom moved faster, sweeping them into his briefcase. Those are copies, I said. The originals are already with the authorities. You stupid bitch, Brian snarled. You have no idea what you've done. Chen will. Will what? Frank's voice cracked like a whip. Destroy us? You already tried that, son. Brian's phone erupted with messages. Jasmine, probably, warning him about Chen. His carefully constructed scheme was unraveling thread by thread. Get out, I said softly. Of this room. Of this store. Of our lives. He moved toward me, face contorted with rage, but stopped short as Tom stepped between us. For a moment, Brian looked like he might strike out at anyone within reach. Instead, he straightened his tie with trembling fingers. You'll regret this, he said, heading for the door. Both of you. After he left, Frank collapsed into a chair, clutching his chest. I reached for him, but he waved me off. It's not over, he wheezed. Chen has friends. Powerful ones. Brian knows all our weaknesses. I watched my father-in-law struggle for breath, knowing he was right. We'd won the battle, but the war was far from over. And we'd just made some very dangerous enemies. The store's security alarm blared through the night as I rushed across the parking lot. Through the windows, I could see flames licking at the walls of Frank's office. Brian stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fire, methodically feeding documents into the blaze. Burning evidence? I called out, my voice steady, despite my racing heart. Or just burning down everything you couldn't steal? He turned, face twisted in a smile I didn't recognize. A little of both. Amazing how fragile paper is. Contracts, deeds, evidence, it all burns the same. The sprinklers hadn't activated. Of course, he'd disabled them during the modernization project. The smoke was getting thicker, but I stepped closer anyway. The police already have copies of everything. They have what you gave them, Brian laughed, tossing another folder into the flames. But not these. Dad's original deed to the property. The real ownership documents. Without them, Chin Development's claim is just as valid as ours. A familiar voice cut through the smoke, that's where you're wrong, son. Frank emerged from the shadows of the stockroom, Tom beside him. Both held phones up, recording everything. Brian's composure cracked. You're supposed to be at the hospital. Because of the medication you've been tampering with? Frank's voice was steel. Tom figured that out weeks ago. We've been waiting for you to make your move. You don't understand, Brian's voice rose, desperate. Chen will destroy us all if this deal falls through. I had to. Had to what? I cut in. Betray your family? Poison your father? Sell out everything he built? I built this too. Brian shouted, grabbing a burning piece of paper. Everything I did was to save us from becoming obsolete. The flames caught his sleeve. He yelped, dropping the burning document. I lunged forward, snatching it from the edge of the fire, the original deed, edges singed but intact. The sprinklers suddenly burst to life, drenching everything. Through the steam and smoke, I saw Jasmine in the doorway, hand on the manual override switch. Her mascara ran in black streaks down her face. It's over, Brian, she said quietly. Chen's been arrested. The development deal is dead. Brian stood there, water streaming down his face, looking suddenly old and small. You helped them? He whispered. They offered me immunity, Jasmine wouldn't meet his eyes. I'm not going down for your family drama. As police sirens wailed in the distance, I watched my husband sink to his knees in the wet ashes of his ambition. Frank placed a hand on my shoulder, and I felt the weight of the deed in my hands, not just paper, but legacy. Trust. Truth. The store would survive. Different, maybe. Changed, certainly. But survive it would. Just not with Brian. The store's bell chimed as I unlocked the front door, morning sunlight streaming through newly cleaned windows. Frank's office still smelled faintly of smoke, but the restoration crew had worked miracles. The old photos were back on the walls, slightly singed but intact, 3 generations of family history watching over us. I found Frank at his desk, sorting through customer letters. Hundreds had poured in after the news broke about Brian's arrest and Chen's development scheme. Not just sympathy notes, but stories. Memories of first jobs, wedding registries, Christmas layaways that mysterious angels had paid off. The insurance check came, Frank said without looking up. More than enough to rebuild. We don't have to rebuild exactly as it was, I replied carefully. Some of Brian's ideas about modernization weren't wrong. Just his methods. Frank nodded slowly, then pulled an envelope from his desk drawer. I've been waiting for the right moment to give you this. Read it. Inside was a deed and a letter, dated 3 months ago. My hand shook as I read, to my true heir. I knew, Frank said quietly. About Brian's plans, about Chen. I could have stopped it earlier, but I needed to see who would fight for this place. For what it really means. Frank, I can't. You already have, he cut me off. Every day for 15 years. You learned every customer's name, every supplier's story. You understood that a store isn't just inventory and profit margins. It's community. Trust. Family. Through the office window, I watched Tom helping our oldest employee, Margaret, set up the morning displays. Outside, customers were already gathering, drawn by the grand reopening banner. Brian called from prison yesterday, Frank continued. Wanted to apologize, to explain himself again. Did you accept? Told him some things can't be fixed with words. Frank stood, straightening his tie. But they can be rebuilt with actions. Over time. If he's willing to try. I thought of Brian in his designer suits, so desperate to escape his father's shadow that he'd burned down everything that mattered. Now I held the deed to that legacy in my hands, not as a victory trophy, but a responsibility. Ready to open up? Frank asked, reaching for his cane. I tucked the deed away and grabbed the keys. The morning sun caught the store's restored sign, Franklin and Family General Store, serving our community since 1952. Actually, I said, I have some ideas about that name. Frank raised an eyebrow, waiting. How about we just call it Family? He smiled, and in that smile I saw the future, not just mine or his, but ours. Something worth protecting. Worth rebuilding. Worth fighting for. The bell chimed again as we opened the doors together.